Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be talking about the genealogy of the king, found in Matthew chapter 1, verses 1 through 17. Matthew chapter 1 starts the book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Now, when we see this genealogy, and this is the opening verse here. This verse 1 starts it introduces the key figures, Jesus and David and Abraham, and then we're actually going to see the actual genealogy in verses 2 through 16, and it will be broken up into three parts. We'll see Abraham to David, and then we'll see David to the Babylonian captivity, and then we'll see a return from Babylon. The return from that Babylonian captivity to Jesus, and then there'll be a summary statement that concludes and mentions the fact that there's 14 generations. Here it is, verse 17. Therefore, all the generations from Abraham to David are 14 generations, and from David to the deportation to Babylon, 14 generations, and from the deportation to Babylon to the time of Christ, 14 generations. So you have a summary that there's 14 names, or 14 generations, 14 names, and 14 names. And the point is made about that, and then that's underscored. Now, to get that 14 names, we actually had to omit 4 of the names that would normally have been in the genealogy, and every Jewish person would know that you went from Jehoshaphat to Joram to Ahaziah, and then Athaliah, and Jehoash, and then Amaziah. But those names are omitted, not just because they were bad kings, but they weren't the greatest kings that they ever saw during that period. But in order to make it into 14, because there would have been 19, and that would have messed up the number arrangement. Now, the reason the number arrangement is needed, the issue of 14, is because Hebrew letters have numeric value. We use the Arabic numerals when we write 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and so on, like we see on the right-hand side of the chart. The Hebrews didn't have those yet. Instead, they had the Hebrew letters, which could serve as Hebrew letters like they do, or they could serve with numerical value. We all played that game when we were a kid, where A represents 1, and then B represents 2, and C, and that's the sort of thing that's happening here. When you write the name David, it's Dawood. We would say they would say it's the letters D and Vav and then D again, which amount to the numbers for 4, 6, and 4. In other words, 14. So there's a little numbers game being played here, and it's not some secret mystery code. It's sort of like when a preacher starts all of the points of his sermon with maybe the letter C or something like that. And he's not being mysterious. He's just trying to be a little bit clever. Now, the genealogy found in Matthew is parallel to one in Luke, although there are some interesting differences. In Matthew's genealogy, it begins with Abraham and moves forward to eventually Jesus. In Luke's genealogy, it actually goes in the opposite direction. It starts with Jesus and then works its way back past Abraham all the way to Adam. In Matthew's genealogy, it's divided into 3 groups of 14, as we noticed. Luke doesn't have any kind of divisions at all. He just gives all the names. In Matthew's genealogy, it omits certain names to keep that pattern of 14 names. That was allowed. In fact, that doesn't mean that the author didn't know about those names. He's just trying to fit a particular pattern. In Luke, there's no omissions of which we're aware. In fact, there's a name added that's found in the Septuagint. Canaan is actually added between Noah and Terah, that is the father of Abraham. There's an extra name that's put in there. In Matthew's case, he traces the line from Abraham through David and Solomon all the way down to Joseph, the adopted father of Jesus. In Luke, remember, he's going back the opposite direction, but he traces the line through another of David's sons, one named Nathan. Now, how do we account for these two differing genealogies? Well, the book of Matthew, especially when we look at the birth narrative of Jesus, everything's going to be from the point of view of Joseph. It will be Joseph, what he's considering, his dreams. We'll see that next time. When we come to the Gospel of Luke, the whole birth narrative is from the point of view of Mary. So maybe this is the genealogy of Mary. So we have Matthew chapter 1, verse 1, the book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. And we already noted that we start off introducing the key figures, and this is the genealogy of a king, because it's presenting Jesus not just the son of Abraham, but the son of David. And that's the kingly line. I think Matthew's setting the stage. He's going to be presenting Jesus as the rightful king, as the better king, as the true king of Israel. And if he's the true king of Israel, then he's also your king and my king when we come to believe in him. In this opening verse, there's echoes from the book of Genesis, so that when we read the book of the genealogy, it reminds me a bit of the phrase that we see so many times in Genesis, indeed the same word. These are the generations, or we could say these are the genealogies of the heavens and the earth, and then these are the generations of Adam, and these are the generations of Noah. 10 times the book of Genesis has that catchphrase, these are the generations. It becomes a way of organizing the book of Genesis. And Matthew is doing the same thing as he opens up this verse. So he's tying his introduction in with the book of Genesis. And of course he's presenting Jesus as the son of David, i.e. the king, and also the son of Abraham, because there's going to be a Jewish flavor to this book. And so as we get into the genealogy, to Abraham was born Isaac, and to Isaac Jacob, and to Jacob Judah and his brothers, and to Judah were born Perez and Zerah by Tamar. And here's the first interesting thing that's mentioned. The name Tamar, you don't usually mention the wives in these. It doesn't say to Abraham and Sarah were born Isaac, or to Isaac and Rebekah were born Jacob. We haven't mentioned any of the women in there, but all of a sudden Tamar is mentioned. And it's interesting that she'd be mentioned because she's not even Jewish. she's a Gentile who sort of married into the family, and indeed when she gave birth to Perez and Zerah by Judah, that really wasn't her husband. That was her father-in-law. And so it had been a very unusual, not a good thing. It's not a great story, but it's a story of what really took place. And so there's some, can we call them negative stories, some colorful stories. That's maybe a nicer way of saying it. And then the genealogy goes on. And to Perez was born Hezron, and to Hezron Ram, and to Ram was born Aminadab, and to Aminadab Nahashon, and to Nahashon Salmon, and to Salmon was born Boaz by Rahab. And again there's a woman mentioned. And again, she's not Jewish. She's actually a Gentile. Remember, Rahab was a Canaanite prostitute who nevertheless aligned herself with the people of God. And now we find out she married into the family of the covenant people and became one of the ancestors of King David. And neither does it stop there. And to Boaz was born Obed by Ruth. And so we find a third woman mentioned. And all three of these so far have been Gentiles, because Ruth wasn't Jewish. She was Moabite. And yet she had associated herself with her mother-in-law Naomi, and had come to the promised land following her back home, and had married Boaz. And they had a child, Obed. And to Obed, Jesse, and to Jesse was born King David. And we're going to see one more, although the next one won't be mentioned by name. Here it is, chapter 1, verse, the rest of verse 6. And to David was born Solomon by her who had been the wife of Uriah. Now, here for the first time, there is a Jewish woman that's mentioned in the genealogy. And we know her name from the Old Testament. Every Hebrew school child knew the name of Bathsheba. But she's not mentioned by name here. And maybe that's because even though those earlier names had been Gentiles, in each of those cases there had been a measure of faith, and we never read about the faith of Bathsheba. And so she's not even mentioned by name here. Instead, her husband, and remember the story of her husband is mentioned, who had been murdered. There's no nice way to put it, by King David. It had not been a pretty story. But then he had taken her as his wife, and eventually they had a son born, and that was Solomon. And so the the genealogy continues. And to Solomon was born Rehoboam, and to Rehoboam Abijah, and to Abijah Asa, and to Asa was born Jehoshaphat, and to Jehoshaphat Joram, and to Joram Uzziah, and to Uzziah was born Jotham, and to Jotham Ahaz, and to Ahaz Hezekiah, and to Hezekiah was born Manasseh, and to Manasseh Ammon, and to Ammon Josiah, and to Josiah were born, and now it slows down a bit again, and to Josiah were born Jeconiah and his brothers. Now, there have been a number of cases where brothers were born, but here it's mentioned, and this was at the time of the deportation to Babylon. And so because the genealogy pauses and mentions the brothers, we need to pause for a moment and mention them too. To Josiah were born Jeconiah and his brothers. Now Josiah had been the last good king of the southern kingdom of Judah. This is after Judah and Israel had split into two kingdoms. Josiah was the last good king, and he was put to death by Pharaoh Necho, who was going up to fight that epic battle of Carchemish against Nebuchadnezzar. And when Josiah died, he died at Megiddo. We commonly call that place Armageddon. The people of Judah took his son Jehoahaz and made him king in Josiah's place. But Jehoahaz only lasted 3 months, and then Pharaoh Necho came and deposed him, took him away, and placed Eliakim, also known as Jehoiakim, on the throne. So Jehoiakim became the next king. And he reigned through when Nebuchadnezzar came and captured Jerusalem. It was Jehoiakim that was on the throne. But Jehoiakim was allowed to stay as king, even though Nebuchadnezzar had captured Jerusalem. But eventually, Jehoiakim rebelled against Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar came back and took Jerusalem a second time. And by the time it was taken, Jehoiakim had died, and his son Jehoiachin, also known as Jeconiah, also known as Coniah, it's sort of like Bill and William, they don't sound anything alike, but they're the same name. These are the same name as well. So Jehoiachin and Jeconiah and Coniah, all the same person. And so he was on the throne when Nebuchadnezzar finally took Jerusalem, and he was deposed. And then his uncle Mathaniah, also known as Zedekiah, he was the last king of Judah before the Babylonian captivity. But notice those other brothers, Jehoahaz and Zedekiah, they're not mentioned here. The one that's mentioned is Jehoiachin, also known as Jeconiah, also known as Coniah. He's the one that's mentioned here in our genealogy. Now, what's interesting is that Jeremiah had a prophecy about this young Coniah, Jeconiah, Jehoiachin, whatever name we use. Here in Jeremiah 22:24, he's called Coniah. As I live, declares the Lord, even though Coniah, the son of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, were a signet ring on my right hand, yet I would pull you off, and I shall give you over into the hand of those who are seeking your life, yes, into the hand of those whom you dread, even to the hand of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, and into the hand of the Chaldeans. And that's going to take place. That Jeremiah is giving it as a prophecy. Sure enough, that prophecy was fulfilled. Even if you were a signet ring on my right hand, I would do this. I'd take you off. The next verse, thus says the Lord, and now it's given almost in the sense of a poem, write this man down childless, a man who will not prosper in his days. For no man of his descendants will prosper sitting on the throne of David or ruling again in Judah. A curse was put on Coniah that none of his descendants would rule upon the throne, would prosper sitting on the throne of David. Now, think about that. That's the genealogy of David. And later on, when the Israelites, when the Jewish people come back into the land, they're not ruled by their own kings anymore. It's true that they have a governor by the name of Zerubbabel, but he is not going to be king. And so we read in the genealogy, after the deportation to Babylon, to Jeconiah was born Shealtiel, and to Shealtiel Zerubbabel. There he is. But Zerubbabel doesn't rule as king. He's at best sort of a tribal leader or governor, but there's no king over the Jewish people at that point. Well, there is. It's the Persian king. It's the Persian emperor. But the Jewish people don't have their own king. And we read the rest of the genealogy from the deportation to Babylon all the way down to Joseph, the husband of Mary. And that's the line of the king, but none of them ever sit upon the throne because God had said through Jeremiah, none of the seed of Jehoiachin, of Coniah, will prosper sitting on the throne, and none of them did. Until we get to Jesus, who is not the physical descendant of Coniah, but he's the adopted son. He's adopted by Joseph, the husband of Mary, and so he has the legal right to the throne, but I would suggest he also has the spiritual right, because he doesn't come under that prophecy, under that curse of the descendants of Coniah. You see, Haggai had said, Haggai chapter 2, verse 23, on that day declares the Lord of hosts, I will take you, Zerubbabel, that same Zerubbabel we talked about, son of Shealtiel, my servant, declares the Lord, and I will make you like a signet ring. Remember how God had said to Coniah, even though you were a signet ring on my finger, I'd take you and throw you off. And yet, Haggai, speaking after the Babylonian captivity, says, I'm not done with Zerubbabel. I'm going to do something special with him. He says, for I have chosen you. Not that Zerubbabel became a king, he didn't. But Zerubbabel's eventual descendant does. He becomes king. And we're talking, of course, of King Jesus. And so we have the completion of the genealogy. After the deportation to Babylon, Jeconiah was born Shealtiel, and to Shealtiel Zerubbabel, and to Zerubbabel was born Abihud, and to Abihud Eliakim, and to Eliakim Azor, and to Azor was born Zadok, and to Zadok Akim, and to Akim Elihud, and to Elihud was born Eleazar, and to Eleazar Mathan, and to Mathan Jacob, and to Jacob was born Joseph, and now we finish it up, the husband of Mary, by whom was born Jesus, who is called Christ. The summary statement therefore says, therefore all the generations from Abraham to David are 14 generations, and from David to the deportation to Babylon 14 generations, and from the deportation to Babylon to the time of Christ 14 generations. In other words, the genealogy points to him being the son of David, the true king of Israel. 14 names, 14 names, 14 names, and the point is that it all spells David, but here we're speaking about the greater David.